In the spring of 2016, the city of Denton, Texas, was experiencing one of its most stable academic years. Denton Community College, a modest institution nestled between suburban developments and long stretches of prairie, prided itself on its small class sizes and attentive faculty. Among its most respected instructors was Julius Montgomery, a 47-year-old African-American professor of literature. He held a master's degree from Howard University and had been teaching for nearly 20 years, the last 12 of which he spent in Denton. His colleagues described him as calm, thoughtful, and meticulously organized. His students saw him as something more, a quiet force who carried himself with measured confidence and emotional depth. Julius taught courses on American literature, post-colonial narratives, and a seminar class called Ethics and the Individual in Contemporary Prose. He had a low, steady voice and rarely raised it, yet students listened with reverence. His lectures were rich with subtext, layered with historical allusions, and often drifted into philosophical terrain. He preferred to teach in circular arrangements, encouraging discussion over memorization. Outside of class, he offered extensive office hours and regularly mentored students through their academic and personal challenges. Despite his popularity, Julius maintained a private life. He lived alone in a modest one-story brick home near the edge of town. He drove an old black Volvo with faded university parking decals and rarely attended faculty events unless required. He had no known family in Denton and didn't speak much about his past. Neighbors recalled him as polite but distant, often seen tending to his front lawn or sitting quietly on his porch in the evenings, reading from thick, annotated novels. To most, he was simply a man who lived for his work, who held the classroom as a sacred space, and who demanded excellence not with aggression, but with quiet conviction. At the college, his name carried weight. Students competed to enroll in his classes, and alumni spoke of him in glowing terms. Yet beneath the professional respect, there existed a subtle mystique. Julius often selected a handful of students, those he considered gifted or emotionally complex, and offered them invitations to off-campus literary salons hosted at his home. These gatherings, held infrequently and never advertised, were the subject of quiet speculation. Attendees were told to bring nothing, only an open mind. Some students described them as life-changing evenings of poetry and conversation. Others never spoke of them at all. By April of that year, Julius had begun organizing a new round of salon meetings. He identified a small group of 4 students from different classes, each talented, each wrestling with personal hardship or identity issues. To the outside world, he appeared to be offering them mentorship, a rare opportunity to connect literature with life. Within the campus environment, such personal involvement from faculty was not uncommon. Professors often formed strong bonds with students, especially in the arts. But in Julius's case, no one knew the full extent of those relationships or what was shared once the classroom lights were turned off. What no one could see, and what no one yet suspected, was that beneath Julius Montgomery's composed exterior and intellectual charisma, something far more complicated and dangerous was beginning to take shape. By mid-September 2016, the academic year at Denton Community College was well underway, and Julius Montgomery's courses were filled to capacity. His selected group of students, Lamar Bell, Michaela Jones, Sean Ellis, and Terrence Quincy, had become regulars at his off-campus gatherings. They were all from different backgrounds but shared a deep intellectual curiosity and a sense of detachment from the wider student body. To outsiders, their closeness to Professor Montgomery seemed like a reward for academic excellence. They often lingered after class, walked together across campus, and attended his literary salons with visible pride. They were seen as protégés, uniquely chosen for something greater. Behind closed doors, however, the boundaries between mentorship and personal intimacy had begun to blur. Each of the 4 students, at different times and under varying circumstances, entered into a private relationship with Julius that went beyond academic mentorship. These connections were not known to each other initially. Julius maintained a careful distance between them, ensuring that their interactions outside the group remained unconnected. He continued to present himself as a mentor, a guide through intellectual and emotional challenges, offering a sense of safety and belonging to young people who often felt alone. In early October, Lamar Bell visited the student health center after experiencing persistent fatigue, swollen lymph nodes, and night sweats. The attending nurse practitioner ordered a panel of tests. Days later, Lamar was called in for a confidential consultation and informed of a positive HIV result. The news devastated him. In his distress, he hesitantly revealed to the clinic counselor that he had been in a consensual but secret relationship with a faculty member, Professor Julius Montgomery. The counselor, bound by mandatory reporting laws, documented the disclosure and passed it to the college's Title IX office. Within 2 weeks, the health center saw similar visits from 2 other students, Michaela Jones and Sean Ellis. Both displayed symptoms consistent with early-stage HIV infection. Each student, in private interviews with medical staff, confessed to having been involved in a sexual relationship with the same faculty member. The 4th student, Terrence Quincy, initially denied any such contact but later admitted to intimate involvement with Julius after being confronted with his own positive test results. The revelations shocked the college administration. Internal reporting mechanisms were activated, and a preliminary investigation was launched. The college's legal counsel and risk management team convened emergency meetings to assess institutional liability. Julius was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, but he refused to comment on the allegations and did not return messages from college officials. At the same time, the Denton Police Department's Special Victims Unit was notified. Detectives initiated a parallel inquiry, focusing on possible criminal charges related to the knowing transmission of HIV, which under Texas law could be prosecuted as aggravated assault if intent or knowledge was proven. With search warrants in hand, investigators entered Julius Montgomery's home. Inside, they found an immaculate space filled with books, handwritten journals, and several personal electronics. Forensic technicians recovered text messages, emails, and photo files that confirmed personal and sexual relationships with the 4 students. In one folder labeled Reflections, Julius had written entries describing his struggle with loneliness, his thoughts on power and intimacy, and his awareness of his medical condition. Among the documents was a lab report dated April 2013 confirming his HIV-positive status. At this point, the case shifted from internal inquiry to active criminal investigation. The campus descended into turmoil. News spread quickly, first through whispers, then through campus news outlets and social media. Parent groups demanded answers. Local media descended on Denton, broadcasting updates as law enforcement pieced together the timeline. The college issued a statement acknowledging the ongoing investigation but refrained from naming individuals. Faculty members were stunned. Students staged protests and organized support groups for those affected. The once respected professor had become the center of a scandal that reached far beyond the confines of the campus. Julius Montgomery did not respond publicly. He remained in his home, unseen, while investigators prepared charges. His world, once built on structure and quiet authority, now stood on the verge of collapse, held together only by his silence and the locked door behind which he waited. On the morning of October 18, 2016, Denton police arrived at Julius Montgomery's residence to serve a formal arrest warrant. The charges included 4 counts of aggravated assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm through the knowing transmission of HIV. When officers knocked on the door, there was no response. The curtains were drawn, the mailbox unemptied, and his vehicle, the old black Volvo, sat in the driveway as it had for days. After receiving no answer and confirming with neighbors that Julius had not been seen in nearly 48 hours, the officers requested and were granted entry. Inside the house, everything was intact. Books remained on their shelves, papers were neatly stacked on the writing desk, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. His laptop, usually stored in his study, was gone. So were a few clothing items and a duffel bag from the closet. In the kitchen sink sat a single mug with the remnants of cold coffee. On the nightstand next to his bed was a half-read copy of a Baldwin novel with a bookmark frozen halfway through the text. It appeared Julius had left voluntarily, perhaps in haste, but not in panic. By noon that day, a missing person alert was issued for Julius Montgomery. His sudden disappearance sent a wave of speculation through Denton and beyond. Some believed he had fled the country, aided by financial means unknown to investigators. Others suggested suicide, referencing his isolation and the emotional pressure of the charges. Police issued a BOLO, be on the lookout, notice across state lines and alerted transportation hubs, but no plane tickets, bus rides, or car rentals under his name appeared in any databases. The next day, a local hiker reported finding an abandoned vehicle near the southern edge of Louisville Lake, a densely wooded area 20 miles from Denton. Authorities confirmed it was Julius's Volvo. The driver's side door was unlocked, and the keys were left inside the center console. Nearby, resting on a rock by the lake's edge, officers discovered his wallet, university ID badge, and a spiral notebook. Inside the notebook were several handwritten pages, most filled with literary quotes and abstract reflections. There was no confession, no direct message, only a final line that read, "Truth must survive its keepers." The shoreline and surrounding woods were searched extensively for several days. Dive teams combed the lake while cadaver dogs swept the trails and brush. No body was found. No footprints, clothing, or personal effects led to a definitive conclusion. After 2 weeks of fruitless searching, the operation was scaled down. Law enforcement reluctantly classified Julius Montgomery as a fugitive. His home was sealed and later cleared of any remaining valuables by a court-appointed executor. His bank accounts showed no activity. His phone was turned off and never reactivated. The college suspended its investigation and formally terminated Julius's employment, citing gross misconduct and abandonment of position. Classes once taught by him were reassigned to adjunct faculty. His former students were offered counseling, and the 4 individuals at the center of the case continued receiving medical and psychological support. For the public, the story faded into uncertainty. News stations moved on. The protests on campus quieted. The house on Maplewood Lane was eventually sold to a new family, and the community settled into a hesitant normalcy. But for those closest to the case, investigators, victims, and colleagues, Montgomery's disappearance remained a gaping wound. He had vanished at the moment accountability was due, leaving behind only questions, trauma, and a legacy contaminated by betrayal. With no body, no farewell, and no further evidence, he became a ghost in the legal system, a name on a warrant with no address. The silence he left behind was louder than any confession he could have given. On a cold morning in February 2018, over a year after Julius Montgomery had disappeared, a hunter named Raymond Coles ventured into the wooded backcountry of Oak Ridge Park, an isolated stretch of land bordering the Trinity River, 30 miles east of Denton. The park, largely neglected and overgrown, was known more for illegal dumping and transient encampments than for recreation. While moving through the underbrush, Raymond noticed a foul odor near a collapsed wooden structure that had once been a maintenance shed. As he approached, he caught sight of what appeared to be bones partially buried beneath a pile of old tires and rotting plywood. He contacted local authorities immediately. Within hours, the area was sealed off, and a forensics team began excavation. What they uncovered were the skeletal remains of an adult male. The body had been hidden deliberately, concealed in layers of debris and organic material. Nearby, they found a rusted wristwatch, a cracked pair of reading glasses, and remnants of fabric consistent with the style of clothing Julius was last seen wearing. A leather notebook, water-damaged but partially legible, was also recovered. Forensic pathologists transported the remains to the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office for identification. Over the following weeks, dental records and DNA samples confirmed the remains belonged to Julius Montgomery. The news made headlines across Texas, reigniting interest in the unresolved scandal that had faded from public memory. Investigators reopened the case, this time shifting focus from a fugitive pursuit to a homicide investigation. Cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with a single impact from a heavy object. The force had fractured the cranium, suggesting an intentional, forceful blow. No drugs or toxins were detected in tissue samples, and there were no signs of defensive wounds, indicating that Julius may have been attacked by surprise or while incapacitated. The discovery altered the narrative entirely. What had once been viewed as an escape from justice now looked more like a silencing. Detectives revisited the original case files, retraced Julius's final movements, and re-interviewed individuals connected to him in the weeks before his disappearance. One person stood out, Lamar Bell, the first student to report being infected, and the only one who had left Denton shortly after Julius vanished. Now 21 and living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Lamar had changed his name legally and was working in a warehouse distribution center under a new identity. When approached by law enforcement, Lamar appeared composed but hesitant. After being presented with new forensic evidence, inconsistencies in his timeline of departure, and digital location data placing him near Oak Ridge Park in late October 2016, he agreed to a voluntary interview. Over the course of several hours, the carefully constructed silence of the past 18 months began to unravel. Under the weight of evidence and emotional pressure, Lamar eventually confessed to confronting Julius at his home the night before the disappearance was reported. According to his statement, the confrontation had turned volatile. Fueled by betrayal, rage, and shame, Lamar followed Julius after he left his house and trailed him to Oak Ridge Park, where a heated argument escalated into violence. Lamar admitted to striking Julius once with a tire iron found near the old maintenance shed. He claimed the act had not been premeditated but born of emotional collapse. After realizing what he had done, he panicked, dragged the body into the abandoned structure, and buried it under debris in an attempt to hide the evidence. His confession was recorded, corroborated with forensic timelines, and submitted to the district attorney's office. Charges of manslaughter and unlawful disposal of a body were filed. Julius Montgomery's death, once surrounded by ambiguity, now had a place, a cause, and a name attached to it. The community of Denton was once again thrust into the spotlight. For the students and faculty who had tried to move on, the discovery brought closure, but also a resurgence of pain, forcing them to reckon with the final chapter of a man whose presence had shaped and shadowed their lives. The trial of Lamar Bell began in the fall of 2018 at the Denton County Courthouse under heavy public attention. Though the initial scandals surrounding Julius Montgomery had largely faded from national discourse, the discovery of his remains and Lamar's confession reignited widespread interest. Local media outlets chronicled the proceedings daily, and a courtroom that had once been quiet was now filled with victims, reporters, legal professionals, and members of the community seeking answers. The courtroom itself became a theater of reckoning, not only for Lamar but for the complex legacy of the man he had killed. The prosecution built its case on a foundation of evidence recovered from Oak Ridge Park, the forensic autopsy, and Lamar's own recorded confession. They did not argue premeditation. Instead, they presented the killing as a violent culmination of sustained psychological damage, betrayal of trust, and emotional instability brought on by Julius Montgomery's abuse. They emphasized that Lamar, at the time of the crime, was only 19 years old and had suffered immensely, not just from a life-altering medical diagnosis but from the manipulation and secrecy surrounding his relationship with a trusted authority figure. Yet the prosecution insisted that justice for Julius's death, however flawed his actions had been, required formal accountability. Lamar's defense team took a measured approach. They acknowledged the facts presented but framed Lamar's actions within the context of extreme emotional distress. They introduced testimony from licensed psychologists who evaluated Lamar in the aftermath of his arrest. These experts testified that he exhibited symptoms of acute post-traumatic stress, depression, and reactive aggression, all of which they believed contributed to the explosion of violence on the night of the incident. The defense further highlighted Lamar's clean record, his cooperation with investigators, and his apparent remorse as mitigating factors. Throughout the trial, 3 of the other students involved in the original HIV transmission case were called to the stand. Each described their relationship with Julius in painful, restrained detail. They spoke not only of the physical consequences of their infections but of the psychological wounds left behind. Their testimonies painted a picture of a predator cloaked in academic authority, someone who used mentorship as a tool for control and secrecy. Though their suffering did not excuse Lamar's actions, it provided critical context that deeply influenced the jury. The prosecution did not push for a murder conviction, instead pursuing a charge of voluntary manslaughter. They argued that while the act was not premeditated, it was still unlawful and fatal. The defense requested leniency, asking the court to consider alternative sentencing or rehabilitation. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a verdict: guilty of voluntary manslaughter and unlawful concealment of a human body. During sentencing, the presiding judge acknowledged the tragedy embedded in every layer of the case. He noted the unusual complexity of a crime in which both victim and perpetrator were, in some measure, broken by the same set of events. Lamar Bell was sentenced to 12 years in a Texas Department of Criminal Justice facility, with eligibility for parole after 7 years. The court also ordered mandatory psychological counseling and access to medical care throughout his incarceration. The verdict brought mixed reactions. Some viewed it as too harsh for a young man pushed to the edge. Others saw it as too lenient, believing that taking a life, regardless of circumstance, demanded greater consequence. What was undeniable, however, was that the trial had forced the community to confront the failures of institutions meant to protect. The courtroom became a place not only of legal judgment but of moral evaluation, where the cost of silence, shame, and abuse was measured not just in years, but in lives permanently altered. By the time Lamar Bell began serving his sentence in early 2019, the town of Denton had shifted back into a rhythm that resembled normalcy. The college resumed its academic cycle, and the campus buildings that once echoed with protests and whispers stood silent again. Yet beneath the surface, a residue of the past remained. The story of Julius Montgomery lingered in faculty lounges, student discussions, and the occasional classroom where ethics were taught with a sharper edge. His legacy was no longer a matter of scholarly respect but a subject of caution and quiet shame. The college administration launched a comprehensive review of its faculty-student interaction policies. Workshops on professional boundaries, informed consent, and power dynamics became mandatory for all academic staff. Counseling services were expanded, and a new office dedicated to student safety and misconduct reporting was established. Julius's name was removed from all course catalogs and faculty archives. His published essays, once taught in advanced seminars, were quietly phased out. Former colleagues seldom mentioned him, and those who had once praised his intellect now distanced themselves entirely. For the 4 students infected by Julius, the aftermath was a lifetime recalibration. Michaela Jones, one of the most vocal in the courtroom, became an advocate for HIV awareness and student protection policies in higher education. She gave public talks and worked with nonprofits to educate young people on medical rights and emotional consent. Sean Ellis completed his degree after a 2-year hiatus and moved to Atlanta, where he started graduate school in counseling psychology. Terrence Quincy left Texas altogether, relocating to Colorado and changing his last name in an effort to reclaim his identity. Each of them carried scars, visible and invisible, that shaped the paths they would follow. Lamar Bell remained a polarizing figure. While incarcerated, he enrolled in correspondence courses and began writing extensively. He published essays from prison reflecting on guilt, vulnerability, and power. Some readers saw in his words a damaged soul seeking redemption. Others saw a man still trying to justify an irreversible act. His name sparked debates about justice and moral consequence, about who holds responsibility when trauma leads to violence. His actions remained unforgivable to many, but his voice became a part of the conversation surrounding institutional failure and emotional collapse. In Denton, community leaders held forums on the legacy of the case. One such event, titled Trust and Truth in Education, was attended by students, educators, clergy, and local officials. The discussions were raw, often painful, but essential. For many in attendance, it was the first time they had spoken openly about how deeply the scandal had affected their trust in schools, mentors, and systems designed to protect the young and vulnerable. A scholarship fund was created in the name of the 4 students who had testified, funded anonymously by a group of alumni who believed that from ruin, something healing could still emerge. Julius Montgomery's house on Maplewood Lane stood empty for 2 years after his confirmed death. The property was eventually sold, renovated, and occupied by a family unaware of its history. To the casual passerby, it looked like any other modest home in the neighborhood. But for those who remembered, it remained a quiet monument to the duality of a man who had offered guidance with one hand while causing irreparable harm with the other. In 2021, a short documentary aired on regional public television titled Silence After the Bell. It chronicled the story in full, from the rise of a respected professor to the exposure of his crimes, the disappearance, the discovery, the trial, and the long shadow that followed. It ended not with resolution but with a pause, a reflection on how easily power can corrupt when cloaked in intellect and charm, and how truth, when buried, has a way of rising in time. Though the case was closed and sentences handed down, the consequences continued to ripple outward. In classrooms across Texas and beyond, conversations about boundaries and consent became louder, more urgent. The story of Julius Montgomery served as a grim parable, not just about a man's fall, but about a system that had failed to see what was hidden in plain sight. The truth had surfaced, but the silence it left behind would echo for years to come.